The Senior Rehab Project is supported by the Game Changers, a group of motivated rehab clinicians that are crushing mediocrity and advancing care for older adults. You can join this group of people and get access to the private Facebook group, the monthly meetup with article discussions, and have a say in the direction of this movement. Get off the sidelines and get involved. Just go to seniorrehabproject.com/Game Changers. Hit me!
This is a Senior Rehab Podcast, the podcast for rehab clinicians that want to better serve older adults. And now your host, my grandson, Dusty Jones.
Hello, friends. Welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast. Thank you for your time today. I am excited for you to hear today's episode because it's a different one. I'm actually going to be republishing or re-airing an episode from my favorite podcast titled OnBeing. If you haven't heard of this podcast, I highly encourage you to check it out. They have an amazing array of different guests, different perspectives. But Krista Tippett is the host, and she is absolutely amazing in her ability to have conversations, meaningful, deep conversations with different types of people. But this interview is with Atul Gawande. Dr. Gawande, he's a physician, is also an author. He's written a couple books that you all are probably aware of, one being the Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right. I've heard this referenced in several of the continuing education courses that I've taken, especially in the functional movement system realm. It's a pretty interesting book, but then he's also written Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. I know several of you all have read that book, are big fans of his work and his writing style, but this interview did not disappoint by any means. Just the conversation is a beautiful one where you really get to hear his voice and how he perceives some of those situations that he finds himself in, which are pretty unique. But I feel like there are tons of lessons and insight for us. Even, we're not having necessarily the end of life conversations with people, but we're spending time with a lot of people that are towards the end of their life. And some of the questions that he asks them, his patients, I feel are very pertinent for us in how we shape our plans of care and how we shape our goals and our interventions as well. So it's really interesting, I know, for me to think about just being a home health PT, and I think you'll gain a lot from it as well. So I reached out to the OnBeing staff and just to ask, hey, could I re-air this on my podcast? And they gave me a thumbs up. So I'm really excited to do this for you all. So I'm not going to edit it whatsoever. When you go to listen to this podcast, if you subscribe to OnBeing, download the unedited episodes. So they'll release kind of the clean, polished radio production, but they leave out a lot of the imperfections, a lot of the rambling, a lot of the things that make it a real conversation. And I really, really enjoy the unedited versions. I mean, the edited versions are amazing, but I would definitely check out the unedited if you have some extra time. So without further ado, let's get into this. This is Krista Tippett hosting the OnBeing podcast, and she is interviewing Dr. Atul Gawande.
I'm Krista Tippett, and this is OnBeing's Unheard Cut. You're listening to my unedited conversation with Atul Gawande. Listen to our produced show with him wherever you find your podcasts, and as always, at onbeing.org. Hi, Atul.
Hi.
Hi, it's Krista Tippett.
Atul Gawande. Atul, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for doing this. I'm so happy.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. This is going to be fun.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to turn off my phone. Let me do that.
Yes, do that.
Get that off.
Chris, let's do something mundane like what you had for breakfast to get some levels.
Oh, I don't get breakfast.
You don't get breakfast?
Lunch. I did get lunch. I got a Caesar salad. I had a Caesar salad. How about that? Do you eat a proper breakfast? Like I tell my patients.
I have started eating just like one egg a lot of mornings and maybe putting a little vegetable in it. Yeah.
This is good. This is what I should be doing.
I know.
I wake up too early to feel like I can eat at that hour.
I know. But I won't tell anyone that you don't eat breakfast because it might have deleterious ripple effects.
That's right. No one should eat the way I eat. Oh, I see. Okay, I can turn it down.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. But today, what I had for breakfast actually was I was in Australia this summer, and I love how fresh the food was, and I found an Australian chef who lives here who makes muesli. Doesn't have much sugar in it, and so I had muesli and yogurt and little hemp seed.
And you pronounce it muesli.
Yeah, that's right.
I thought it was muesli.
They don't call it granola. Okay. Well, great. Then I think we can just dive in. And do you have any questions for me before we start?
Yes. How long do you think? How long do you tape? Do you edit? Like what do you do?
We do between 60 and 90 minutes. We probably about 75.
Okay.
And then we edit it for broadcast, but we also do put the unedited version out, and there's a surprising number of people who love listening to a great big messy conversation, a non-linear conversation.
And then turf. Is this just like where should I restrict myself, or is it? Are we mainly talking about being mortal, or are we thinking we're going in a lot of different directions?
Yeah. Well, I kind of just want you to put yourself into my hands and let me.
So you'll guide me.
I will guide you. Yeah, and it is really around larger things. The theme of mortality. But I want to go deep into that and ask you some questions I haven't seen other people asking you, but I think things you think about and write about all the time, and a little bit of the checklist as well. I mean, I've been reading you for years and in the New Yorker, and I like to kind of be more sweeping about like how you think as opposed to just what the books are about.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. That's awesome. That's great. Yes. The full Tippett.
That's right. The full Tippett. So perhaps you know that I always start every conversation with an inquiry about the religious or spiritual background of your childhood, however you think about that, however you would define that.
Okay. Start in?
Yeah.
Okay. So my parents are Hindu. I grew up in rural Ohio. It's hard to grow up in my little town of Athens, Ohio. It's a college town in the Appalachian foothills near the West Virginia border. And it's hard to grow up a Hindu in rural Ohio. Yeah. It's such a cultural religion. It's deeply embedded. Even the way my mother, who comes from North India in a big city, and her family managed temples to where my father came from in the middle of India in a very small village. And their own traditions of Hinduism are very different from one another, which gods they most revered and the prayers that they told. And then I didn't grow up with the language. So it was this, I grew up a Hindu, but I'm a sort of apostate Hindu of a religion that doesn't even know the idea of it being an apostate. It's such a wide open, ecumenical, welcoming religion. Yeah. And so, I still call myself a Hindu, but I've never really been practicing, though my parents raised me praying every weekend, and they prayed every day, and being sort of steeped in it.
I have actually found it's very hard to speak. I mean, I think this is true in general of religion, but it's hard to speak about it. But I think that's true, especially with Hinduism, because it is so much about practice, and it is so wide open, right? It's not ideas, right?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
It's a way of, it's so embedded in the culture, and, the line between how do you treat your mom and your dad, and what are your, how are you supposed to grow up, and your ways of praying are, it's seamless. These are not easily separated. For example, I grew up that you never put your foot on a book, because a book is spiritual and it's wisdom and it's meaningful. And so if I ever put a foot on a book, I had to apologize to the book, put my hand on and apologize. And I grew up doing that. And I cannot to this day put a foot on a book. It is just sacrilegious. It is dishonoring not only the book, but everything that matters behind it. And it's inseparable, right? It's a way of living and a way of praying, I suppose.
It's a whole different way of putting the word sacred and text together, too.
Yes.
I love that. Okay. And, I have read you for years, but I did not, somehow I never picked up, I was fascinated to learn that you actually wound your way into being a surgeon through politics.
Yeah.
And I wonder, do you think of those, the doctor in you and the part of you that was drawn to politics and campaigns and policy and process, are those two different sides of you, or do you have a sense that these things are intertwined?
I feel like they are not separate. They feel very intertwined, and I'm still getting my feel for how I think about it that way. One way was I grew up in a family of doctors, and there's a certain way of being part of the community that I grew up with. My parents in a rural town in Ohio were very much part of the civic life. They were members of the Rotary Club. My father became the president of the Rotary Club, and then my mom, as soon as the ban on women being president of the Rotary Clubs, as soon as that lifted, she challenged locally and became the president of the local Rotary Club. And that sense that you are, as a clinician, a physician, part of the community, that you have, that you're contributing, has always kind of been there. I mean, what I love about medicine is the idea that it has this core thousands-year-old commitment to the idea that all people have equal worth and deserve equal dignity, and that we're enacting that and trying to serve that every day. But that has larger connotations than just whether you are getting the same surgery that some muckety muck is getting.
And I think that actually also gets at the fact that you are a writer as much as you are a physician, and that in your writing, the policy, the side of you that in politics and now from the vantage point of medicine asks these questions about policy and structures and values and how we honor those, that gets picked up in your writing and kind of joins these things.
Yeah, I had no idea that would be the way that it came together. The policy interest and politics interest came from was about how do we make this world better in some way? How do we make very concrete things better? And there's a sense of also that comes out of the science work I do that it's inherently empirical. You have to everything has to be a kind of experiment. You got to try things based on your best guess of how the world works. And then you got to collect data and really understand, did it work? Did it not work? And whether it's a biological system or an operation I'm doing where we're going to try out a new technology and see if it really makes a difference, or it's the outside world system, that's where they connect. But the part that then is missing is the fact that every time you get into the reality of it's real people with different goals and different abilities, whether it's me, the surgeon, and the fact that I'm imperfect and I've got things I'm not good at and things I'm good at, and how we're nonetheless, I'm asking you to trust me and to rely on me. And the minute I connect with you as a patient, we're in a different world, and you're in a wholly different person, and it's more complicated than just what the scientific studies indicated, and there's complex goals and desires you have, and you don't always feel good about my imperfections, and so all of that suddenly enters into a space that starts to be about story, and are working our way through the messiness of the reality of how science and systems and the world meet human beings. And I feel like we're in this important, unusual space where we've accumulated enormous amounts of knowledge. We're no longer in a world of pure ignorance like we were for millennia. And we're trying to figure out how to grapple with all this information and knowledge and make sense of it together.
I agree. I think that we're learning so much. We're like in the midst of learning it. So I don't even think we can take in the kind of seismic shift that's underway and the implications of how we'll be able to kind of take our agency more seriously. I mean, this whole matter of our mortality. You really, we've talked about politics and medicine, and also there's this philosophical. You were really also looking at very practical issues and asking philosophical questions. Looking at the body and asking questions of consciousness, and it's just so. I was looking at just thinking about the title, becoming mortal.
Or being mortal.
Being mortal. Yeah, sorry. Being mortal. And the fact that that is a fact, like that being alive is a fatal condition, like that we all are, that we all do have a diagnosis that we will die. And that you experience again and again and write about how, and yet we are the people are almost always surprised. It's just so fascinating about us. And do you think, is it that we don't let it into our consciousness, that we haven't gotten to the point where we can, or that we resist that?
I dove into that topic because I was as confused about it as you are. First of all, I didn't know what it meant to be a good doctor for mortal beings. The question of what does it mean to be competent with people who are going to have problems you cannot fix?
Yeah.
What does it mean to go beyond competence and actually be really great at problems that people are going to die from? And also, how do you become competent and great at it if you don't know whether the problem you're dealing with certainty is one they're going to die from or not? And that's why at the end of the day, that's why I write, because those kinds of questions, I can't answer them straightforwardly sitting in my armchair or just doing my surgical thing. I get to go out when I say, hey, I'm going to see you as a writer today. I get to go out and ask people tons of questions. And I think what came out of that for me was a general sense that that peering in at why, part of it was that I slowly figured out we're just getting the question wrong. I thought of it as the situations to serve me the most were ones where someone would come in, they'd have a condition that I knew was incurable, a terminal cancer. But we don't know, is it going to be a year? Is it going to be 3 years? Is it going to be 5 years?
And
therefore
that bar
we start
keeps moving, right, all the time now.
That's right. We have new technologies. Yeah. And so we're going to start trying stuff. And then I have so often been there when we said, let's try that one more thing. And they're in a bad situation. We say, well, should we try surgery? Well, yes. We have to give it a try. And then they never wake up again. And then you see the suffering that has come from that because we never once talked about the fact that their life might be mortal, is mortal. And I didn't even know how to begin to have that conversation. And they never woke up. They spent the next couple weeks in the ICU, and then we unplugged the machine. They didn't get to say goodbye. They didn't get to say, I love you. They didn't get to say, I'm sorry. And the family, that the data is that, like, the families, I see that they're tortured, but then you see also, like, when people have those kinds of endings, 6 months later, families are more likely to have PTSD symptoms and depression. And And there was partly wanting to understand, how do I do better in that situation? What does it mean to be more confident and competent in those situations? But it also gradually came to, what I slowly realized is that it wasn't about having a good death. I interviewed more than 200 patients about their experiences with terminal illnesses and that world, and then scores of experts of various kinds, palliative care doctors, hospice doctors, and nurses, and home health aides, and so on. And what I realized is we were not really talking about death. We were talking about, or dying. We were really talking about, how do you live a good life all the way to the very end, with whatever comes.
Yeah, so
that's where you begin to unpack.
And that's where you say that's such a different question than, how do I fix this? How do I cure this? And I mean, I've spoken to so many people across the years who were there at the advent of the hospice movement, or have been involved in that. And I mean, you even write about that. Even when you were becoming a doctor, when you were going through your medical training, it was about how do I fix this? And then death was a failure, right? And then at the point at which somebody was definitely going to die, medicine stopped. Is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that, are we going to, go raging at the extinguishing of the light? That I thought the whole question was, the conversation I felt like I was having was, do we fight or do we give up?
Right, right.
And the reality was that it was, and that was where you said something. You said, that's such a different question. That's what it took me a long time to figure out, was just the wrong question. It's not, do we fight or we give up? It's, what are we fighting for?
Right.
People have priorities besides just surviving no matter what. You have reasons you want to be alive. What are those reasons? Because whatever you're living for along the way, we got to make sure we don't sacrifice it. And in fact, can we, along the way, whatever's happening, can we enable it? It's and that's that sense that a conversation about the end of life is, do you want chest compressions? Do you want a ventilator? Do you want to be shocked? Like, that's not the conversation. The conversation, no one has as their goal that I get shocked before I die. Yeah. The conversation is, what do you want as you face what you're facing, as you go through what you go through? What are you willing to sacrifice? And what are you not willing to sacrifice along the way for the sake of more time? What's the minimum quality of life you're really going for here that you would find acceptable? And then, can I make sure, to the extent of my abilities, the extent of abilities we have today in medicine, can we protect that for you? And the answer is often yes, and often sometimes the answers are technological, but they're often not. It's often just, a matter of being humane. Someone, said to me, well, I want to take my children to Disney World, my grandchildren. Mm-hmm. One thing I want to make sure I'm able to do is take my grandchildren to Disney World. And she was telling that to me in the hospital, emaciated, on her last days. She would die 48 hours later. And we had missed that. We right. had failed. We had never asked her to know that might have mattered to her, because we could have made that possible for her a month before.
If those questions had been asked earlier.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't about, do we fight or not? It's that we missed the fight. The fight was to make sure, among other things, that she got to go take her grandchildren to Disney.
I mean, here's, there, when you're writing, you're often, I feel like there are moments when you really are redefining the purpose of medicine as you learned it. And it says, and a very modern definition, but, you said we've been wrong about what our job is in medicine. We think our job is to ensure health and survival, but really it is larger than that. It is to enable well-being, and well-being is about the reasons one wishes to be alive. And it's not just about prolonging life.
I ended up devoting a chapter to a psychologist from Stanford that it never occurred to me would be with where the direction of the book would go. But her name is Laura Carstensen, and she is the psychologist who's been following people across the course of their lives. She has a cohort of some 300 people from ages 18 to 94 when they started in her study, and she'd follow them all the way to the end of their life. And what was interesting to me was that as they got older, they became less healthy. No surprise. And they had some loss of function along the way. But they also had increasing sense of fulfillment in their life, despite all of that. That you, in some other studies, that after age 65, people were more likely to have love in their life. They were less likely to have anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
They were focused less on acquisition and having all the material stuff.
This is another one of these great secrets that growing old is actually a wonderful thing, and we're all about fighting aging.
Right. And and it was where it blew up my whole sense of what I was doing as a doctor is I thought my priority was your health and your independence. And then that means I was always lost. Like, what is my goal for people when they're not healthy anymore, or they don't get to be independent? And then what she opened up for me was the recognition that well-being was really about getting to, what made those people happy, and when they lost that happiness is when they no longer were having some control over their own story, that they were not getting to be the shapers of their own story. And that's what you see in people who are in hospitals or in many nursing homes, not all, where our goal is safety, survival, and health. And hey, if you want to opt out of that, if you don't want the antibiotics, you don't want whatever, well, then that's your choice. But it was missing the boat. The goal isn't safety and survival. The goal is, as you'd read from that part, the goal is what you're doing that for. What is important to you? What are your priorities? And make sure we enable that. And that's why you can be you can gradually lose some functions and have some health issues along the way, and yet have great satisfactions in life.
Yeah, well-being, and it's very concrete too. I mean, enabling well-being is a very lofty idea, and then you talk about this woman who would have liked to have taken her grandkids to Disneyland, which is obviously a big undertaking. But it's so many of the stories you talk about are just like it's about what. So you have these 5 questions to ask towards the end of life, and some of them are about your understanding of your illness, your fears or worries for the future, your goals and priorities, what outcomes are acceptable. But the 5th one, which seems to come through again and again, is what does a good day look like? And I think about Annie Dillard saying how we spend our days is how we spend our lives, and you tell so many stories about how just allowing those days to have the simple things that give people a sense of well-being, that is everything.
Yes. And what I also figured out was that, boy, it's almost too late if you're only asking that question towards the end of life,
right? Because
that you realize we should have been asking much earlier. Especially at any, this is the crucial question at any moment that people need help. And on average, we will come to the end of life. We actually spend less time in dependency now than we used to. But it's still, we spend 8 years on average in needing the help of others over time. And when you start needing help, and whether it's a home health aide or having to be in a nursing home, or just having to see a clinician and put your self in their hands, asking those questions like, what does a good day look like? What are your priorities besides just, surviving the next day?
Yeah.
And answering those questions, I've found it's become my favorite, dinner party question too, because, what is the quality of life that you would live for if you couldn't do everything you wanted? And, one person would say, it's being with family. My father said, for example, it's being at the family dinner table with family and friends and being able to enjoy some food and conversation and a connection that way. And then, I wrote about the other person who said, well, it's, if I can eat chocolate ice cream and football and television, that's good enough for me.
Right.
And then I met a health minister, and I'm like, so we were in his office, and he had all these beautiful pictures of his family in the room, and I said, so what is the minimum quality of life? What is the good day for you? Is it being with your family? And he said, well, no, it's complicated.
Yeah.
He said, honestly, if I can just have a good book and some quiet, I would give up a lot to still be able to have that. And, it tells you so much about people, and, that.
Well, it does, but it also points out, that's so low tech, right? The medical options are so complicated and expensive and sophisticated. These are not unreachable goals, even for somebody who might be quite ill, to have a good book.
Absolutely. And sometimes it does take that medical capability. I wrote about Peggy Batchelder, who was my daughter's, when she was 13, her piano teacher, who had a metastatic cancer and was laid up in the hospital for weeks on end, deteriorating with a tumor that had spread through her liver and was in her pelvis and made it so that she couldn't get out of bed, and she was incontinent, and and none of the treatments were working, and her blood counts were dropping, and she had fevers every day. And, neither she nor I had any imagination that there might be a life worth living for at that point. She just was miserable and angry, and ultimately went home on hospice. And then the hospice nurse had that conversation. What does a good day look like? And then let's have a goal, one good day. And then they worked on that. And at first was, okay, we're going to get you a bedside. We're going to get you in a bed on the first floor so you don't climb the stairs. We're going to get a bedside commode so you can get back to a toilet again. We're going to arrange that you can for getting dressed and bathed. And after 2 or 3 days of that, she lifted her sights. And then she wanted to teach piano again.
Right.
And the idea that was possible was, it was extraordinary. My daughter, she called our home and said, would you be willing to let Hunter have piano lessons again? And so for 4 weeks, my daughter had the most extraordinary piano lessons. And then there was a recital. And at that recital, they played Brahms and Chopin and Beethoven, and then Peggy took each child to the side and gave them a book. Gave each of them a personal gift. It was for my daughter, a book of music, and then told them each one by one, "You're special." And it reshaped my daughter's life, and that was the legacy Peggy wanted to leave. My daughter just entered 2 weeks ago, graduated from high school.
Congratulations.
And is and entered Berklee School of Music because of Peggy. They were together, only a couple of years.
Yeah. But
it made that impact. And that was that idea that was beyond us, that was beyond, so I was saying about medicine. Well, to teach that lesson, her nurse had to arrange that to figure out how to dose the morphine so that she wouldn't be in pain when she needed to teach the lesson, but wouldn't be so groggy that she would be slurring her speech and freaking out the kids.
Right.
But could lift her up to arrive at that moment and then recover and get to the next one.
That's beautiful.
And that took it took real medical expertise too.
Yeah, that collaboration. I know you've thought about this too, but one of the things I want to spend a little bit of time on, because you also are very clear that in many ways what we're facing. I don't know that I think mortality and the fact of mortality has been this constant theme of philosophy and religion and even how we deal with money forever. But the problem of death is different. We have a young modern problem with death, but it has many layers. And one of them, you talked about growing up in Ohio. you said the experience of a modern old age was entirely outside my perception because of changes in family and society and mobility. We're so segregated. We don't have that experience. So, I mean, I just think about your daughter, also the experience that she had with her teacher and of someone dying, living while dying.
Yes, I think that is
amazing.
I think we've gone through a really a generational change in the 80s and 90s. When I was growing up, the world we were in was one where let me put it this way: 1950, the majority of Americans, it was over 90% died in their homes, and it shifted to the majority. 80% actually, by 1990, died in institutions. So when I grew up, on my street, people would get old and they just disappear. I remember a woman, you'd disappear in a nursing home, you'd disappear in the hospital, and that was that. And I never saw that process. Whereas now today, America, we give the U.S. a hard time for being death denying, but in fact, we're kind of ahead of the rest of the world in the sense that just in the last half decade or so, we went from less than 20% being at home on hospice when they die to close to 50% being in hospice, either in hospice facility or at home with family and others around, that kind of way of coming to that end.
Just really kind of in the last 20, 30 years?
Less than that. It's like less than a decade the shift has happened.
That's amazing.
It is. And the result is my kids growing up who, Hunter is our last one to leave the home. So they, just in the last 5 years, all of them when they were teenagers were around when somebody died and were in and out of their house as they were going through it. My daughter's best friend's mom died of an esophageal cancer. And my daughter was there through that year and a half of going through that. And then having hospice, and then her father calling Hattie and asking her to bring the friend back home because mom had passed away, and Hattie was there and with them. And, that sense of it being normal and not a mystery and
having a quality to it, right? Seeing that is actually a time of life that can have an amazing quality to it.
I was going to ask what you meant by the quality, and what do you mean by?
Well, I mean a quality of life. I mean that there's meaning and dignity, not just dignity, but real substance. Right? It's not just somebody is in bed dying; that they're living and doing things that matter to them.
And it's finding your way through that, because there's plenty that also was not quality, right?
Yeah.
That she would arrive and Peggy had to work her way through some pain and work her way through some indignity, but then also find something really beautiful about that. Or, in another case, sometimes see the struggle for that and have real conversations we'd have at home about, why isn't it? Why is it so hard and painful? And what are, reaching that place where you say, you could see people in denial about the situation and not being able to talk about it. They'd see families where they wouldn't be able to talk about anything except what's the next treatment we can try, instead of saying, all right, what is the next treatment try, but also what's possible today? What can we do today that also makes sure we're not missing the chance to enjoy the time we have?
Yeah.
And those aren't opposed to each other. And we start to see these conversations unfolding in multiple generations. And I think that's crucial. That is, and there's strong evidence behind what a difference it is for the experience that people have towards the end, and even what their survival rate is when you have these conversations versus when you don't.
Mm-hmm. And this is also, I think a lot about how, some of the ways we grow more wise and sophisticated in our thinking are about innovation, and some of them are about rediscovering something we forgot. So, there's a way in which kind of modern medicine is meeting, a very old experience. Like you talk about your paternal grandfather in India. There is also this way before people got sent away to nursing homes, people died surrounded by family and at home.
Yeah, that complexity. I mean, I described my grandfather's death. He got to live to 108 years in that village in Maharashtra that with family all around. And, he spent the last 20 years of his life with infirmities that would have put him in a nursing home in the United States. But there he was with family. He was at the head of the dinner table. People would come to him to bless their marriages, to get advice on business decisions, he was respected as the elder and could have that all the way to the very end. But it came at a cost. That was possible because the younger generation, especially the women in the younger generation, were more or less enslaved to his needs, his physical needs, his that and what India is going through right now is what we went through in the 19th century, which is the shift from an agricultural economy was that young people got freedom. My cousins, they are leaving in droves because they have opportunity to go to the city, to do the work they want, to marry whom they want. Scandal, believe me. Oh my God. And and to start to be who they want. And then you have the breakdown of the extended family. We treat it as like, and my father would say, we would never treat the elderly in India the way we treat people in the United States because it's the Asian way of having the extended family. But I'm watching, and I wrote about the breakdown in the extended family in India as they advance economically and industrialize because it involves people moving to cities, following their dreams. Yeah. And you get this complicated picture. The hump, the thing that we broke through to eventually was that you live long enough to actually accumulate pensions, and you have a certain level of economy that can have the next thing. And we switched from the elderly being the poorest to actually accumulating enough to be our wealthiest generation. Yeah. And not mean that being elderly consigns yourself to poverty. Right now in India, though, being elderly consigns you to poverty, and there's that the economy's not at that point yet where pensions and the equivalent of Social Security have taken a hold yet.
Yeah. It's interesting I wonder if as we move forward as a globalized world, if then we just keep teaching each other back and forth, or
I think we are. I mean, one of the interesting things about universal health coverage is, when the U.S. adopted universal health coverage, not universal, we aren't there yet. Boy, are we not there yet.
No, we're not there.
But when we adopted Medicaid and Medicare for the elderly and for the poor in 1965, we were past $15,000 per capita GDP in earnings as an economy. Korea in 1980 was below $10,000. India just passed has enacted for the last few years for below the poverty line, the equivalent of their Medicaid program at $1,500 GDP per capita. Mm-hmm. So, when we enacted Social Security, when Germany enacted the Bismarck's pension system, those were, the economies weren't huge then. And I think it's possible to see that come to these transitioning economies as well. And those are all really important. The place we've come is just a century ago, you only lived on average to your mid-40s.
Yeah.
In a place like the U.S. We now live past 80, and we are making it possible to have meaningful lives across that whole lifespan. And it's thinking about it and acknowledging it, and then recognizing that what a good day looks like at age 10, age 30, and age 70 necessarily look like very different things.
Yeah. But that there are very good days at age 70 and possibly even at 108. I mean, the other thing, there's aging and dying of having a long life, and then there's another thing you write a lot about is this, this modern tragedy of kind of lives that are extended kind of brutally, with all the best intentions and all the best aspirations, and all of our best tools. I thought it was interesting that you note that when you have this process of asking patients about their priorities, you discover what they're living for, that often that very same process ends up identifying the limits to the kind of care that people want, that emerges in a humane and organic and very thoughtful way, in a way that it doesn't when medicine is just in this battle mode of, well, what's the next fight?
Yeah, this is really crucial, because what we often think is that putting your quality of life as a consideration means you're sacrificing quantity of life, because I'm, thinking twice about whether to have that chemotherapy or undergo that operation. And the evidence is that it's not the case. There are many kinds of studies. The most powerful one for me was a study that Jennifer Temmel, a Massachusetts General Hospital physician, led, which took care of stage 4 lung cancer patients. They lived only on average 11 months. It's a terminal condition. No one lived past about 3 years. And what she did was half of the groups were randomized to get usual oncology care, and the other half were randomized to get the usual oncology care plus a palliative care physician to see them early in the course of their illness. Now, usually as a cancer surgeon, I would say to someone who'd say, I used to say, that when they said, I want to see a palliative care clinician, I'd say, no, we don't have, it's not time for that yet. We still have options. And it was only there for the end, And so it was kind of a radical idea, see them from the very beginning. And what the group who saw the palliative care clinicians from the very beginning did end up stopping their chemotherapy, 50%, they were 50% less likely to be on chemotherapy in their last 3 months of life. They were 90% less likely to be on chemotherapy in their last 2 weeks of life.
Wow.
They were less likely to get surgery towards the end. They had 1/3 lower costs. They started hospice sooner. They spent more time out of the hospital. They were less likely to die in the hospital or die in the ICU. And the kicker was that they not only had overall less suffering, they lived 25% longer.
Oh my gosh.
And that's the thing we're missing out on.
That's fascinating.
It's like if it were a cancer drug, if it were a pill, it would be, this blockbuster company and we'd all want stock in it, the whole thing. But it's just, and then when I trace down, like, what are you guys doing? And how can I do it next week? Without having to be you guys. The answer was, they were just having these conversations, identify their priorities.
It's just one person talking to one human being and another human being.
And activating to think, my good day is X. If I start feeling like my chemotherapy or my surgery is going to take that away from me, and that's not worth it to me, stop. Yeah. And then they stop, and they feel better. And they do better for longer, because the other thing it hooks up with is that we as clinicians are excessively optimistic about the power of what we're going to be able to do for you. We're 5 times more likely to predict.
And physicians are authority figures, right? I mean, physicians are some of the people in the world who we just, hand over and think, believe that they know. And, you've said that we imagine that we can wait until the doctors tell us that there's nothing more they can do, but rarely is there nothing more that doctors can do. I mean, the scenario that you're describing where there's this conversation and this participation, it's like it gives the patient or the person their agency back.
This was what has been most transformative in my practice that I did not understand. So what a clinician does, what we do with our authority has been a very tense issue over time. And by the 1990s, when I was in medical school, we had rejected paternalism, rightly. The doctor knows best. I'm just going to tell you what to do. We had replaced it with a belief in the patient's autonomy and a way of activating that. And the way of activating that was to give you options, to tell you, here is your condition, here are the options, option A, option B, option C. Here are the pros, the cons, the risks, the benefits. Now, what do you want to do? And then what I found in the real world, like that was the way I was taught to exercise my authority, was to give people knowledge and then ask what they want to do with it. But what I found in the real world was that patients would ask back, well, what would you do?
Right. Right.
And
because you still know better. You still know better.
And so what we're taught to say, so that you don't take away their agency, was, no. This is not for me to decide. This is for you to decide. Only you know you. I don't know you. And you have to make the call here around what's more important to you. And people felt completely abandoned, and it never felt good. And what the palliative care clinicians, when I watched them, or geriatricians would do, is they would go one step farther. They would ask, not just tell you what your options are. They would listen to ask, what are your goals? What are your priorities? What really matters to you? Oh, you want to be at home.
Right.
You don't want to, you worry, for you, your brain is really important, and you want to be as clear cognitively as possible. Okay, so now here are option A, option B, option C. This is the one that I recommend, based on my experiences, giving you your best chance of meeting your various goals.
Right.
And it's a new, and that idea is that you are a genuine counselor, that you have the only way you can offer wisdom is by connecting what you know and have observed about what happens with various things to the goals that this individual person has. And the art of it is, can I listen well enough? Can I extract from this conversation enough to tell me what you really care about, to give you some guidance along the way here? And that, is hard. I learned from the palliative care folks, like one person said to me, the family conversation is my procedure. It takes as many of those family conversations learned with deliberate practice to be great at it as it takes for you to learn to do your cancer operations. And so think of it that way.
As I was reading the way you redefine, when you say about medicine, we think our job is to ensure health and survival, but really it is to enable well-being. I was thinking about, I was very honored this year to be invited to give the commencement address at the University of Minnesota Medical School. And I was so impressed with the pledge that the students of the class of 2017 had written when they started. And then I think they also give the students the opportunity to rewrite that at the end, but they actually kept the one they had. I wanted to read a little bit of it to you because I wondered also if you think there's a generational shift. I was really stunned. So I'll just read it. So, in the presence of our families, colleagues, and communities, we take this oath in recognition of the honor and privilege of becoming a physician. We arrive at the threshold of our chosen profession, pledging to preserve our humility, integrity, and all the values which brought us to the practice of medicine. We will engage in honest self-reflection, striving for excellence, but acknowledging our limitations and caring for ourselves as we care for others. We will collaborate with our colleagues, patients, and communities to improve the practice of medicine. We will discover, innovate, learn, and teach as responsible stewards of medical knowledge. And then they say, we will seek to heal the whole person rather than merely treat disease, committing to a partnership with our patients that empowers them and demonstrates empathy and respect. We will cure sometimes, treat often, and comfort always.
That's great.
Isn't that good?
That last part in particular.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. And I have to say, it was the day of, there was all this drama going on in Congress about the healthcare bill and insurance. And it was so wonderful to be with them and see them and read this pledge they've taken that they wrote. That's so very different from what I think a doctor of my generation would have written. And to see, this is the future of medicine, right? This is it, this care.
I think the place we are coming to that is when you take that pledge seriously and then really think about what the goals people have, that it becomes a really interesting dialogue because people often are not sure about their goals, or they have contradictory goals. For example,
okay.
I, for example, will badger my patients about quitting smoking and wearing a seatbelt.
Right.
But their actions are telling me they want to not wear the seatbelt or want to keep smoking. They're telling me what their priorities are, right? But there's first order priorities. I want to eat what's in the refrigerator. And there's higher order priorities. I really want to put a lock on the refrigerator.
Right.
and being able to recognize when should we be thinking about the bigger, longer-term priorities, and when do we think about the everyday priorities and joys, and navigate between these pathways. And then there's some public health priorities, like I want to be part of making sure, people are that we're protecting people against diseases that are vaccine treatable.
Yeah.
And so this complicated discussion about what are your goals, what are the ones we're going to arrive at and agree on are important. And sometimes if I'm an effective counselor, I might argue with you about your goals.
Right.
And that role as a clinician of all kinds, not just doctors, but it's nurses, psychologists, teachers, ministers. That is, we come back to writing again, right? That is the deeper dialogue.
Yeah, but that's the kind of arguing we do with people we love, right? That's also a form of care. That's the spirit.
That is when it is health care.
Right. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Did you know Sherwin Newland, Shep Newland? Did you know him personally?
I did.
Yeah.
I did. I got to, so Shep Newland, surgeon at Yale, read his book, How We Die, which one I think was 1980 or 82 or something, National Book Award winner. And it just blew the top off my head.
Mm-hmm.
A book that, opened the door on, I think that was the book that started me thinking hard about dying and what it means. I read it later. I was in medical school in the 90s, and I had no idea I would get to meet him and know him then. But when I then started writing for the New Yorker, and then wrote my first book, Complications, during my surgical residency, he wrote the review in the New York Review of Books, and then reached out to me, and it was this great, very special relationship. We met only once, actually, face to face, but we weirdly enough on Talk of the Nation, we ended up doing a regular thing where,
really?
I was like where he was the senior eminence and I was but the junior pop doctor, and we would talk about a topic of the day, every few months. It was now and again, but it became this dialogue that carried on, and I just was such a huge admirer and someone who, was navigating his own difficult paths. He had written about his deep depression and the conflicts he'd had in his life, and so he had a tough life and things he had to struggle through, and so that was a. I
love thinking about that cross-generational conversation between the two of you. I interviewed him years and years and years ago, and actually went to college with his daughter, and then we had this beautiful correspondence. It's not like it was all the time, but I also just held him in great regard and with great fondness. And the conversation I had with him was about some of the things he started thinking about, later. We actually called the show The Biology of the Spirit. And, he was thinking a lot about our brains and about what spirit is. And what did he say? That the human spirit is an accomplishment of the human brain, like just with this awe of, because, he went on after he talked about how we died. He about how the miracle of like how much works all the time, like how we live, right? He wrote that follow-up book.
Follow-up book, yeah. Which of course, for less people were interested in how we live.
Yeah, less people were interested, and it was just full of wonder. Yeah. I mean, I just kind of I was just thinking of that because I want to ask you about this and I offer that as a way into this idea of spirit, like, whatever that is, if it is an accomplishment of our biology. But I one of the things that I ended up talking with these medical students about was, I really do think, and I want to know I want your response, because 50 years from now, people will look back at the way we used to use this phrase, mind, body, spirit, and think kind of how primitive that was, because so much of what we're learning is about the distinction between these things. Again, like however you want to define spirit, we know what we're talking about, but that what we call emotion and spirit are as physical as they are mental, and that the brain lays physical pathways and takes bodily direction, and that trauma and joy are in our bodies as much as they're emotional. I just wonder if you think about that, because it seems to me that even though I don't know that I see you using that language very often, that this runs through your reflection, the wholeness of us, the kind of mysterious fullness of us.
Yeah. There's many ways in which I find the word spirit so difficult to understand. I use it all the time.
It's a squishy word. It is. It's a vague word.
I use it when for example, one of the ways I use it is just simply to ask people, after we're done talking about, how are you doing? And people then tell me about their aches and their pains and what their temperature's been doing and so on. And then I'll say, how are your spirits? Or how is your spirit? And that's one level. But then there's this interconnected level, the sense of spirit at a kind of starts to become spiritual, right? The ways in which there's some sense of something transcendent, at least connect across all of people, if not beyond that.
Yeah.
And I grapple with it a little bit towards the end of the book.
Yes, you do.
When I take my dad's ashes to the Ganges.
Exactly.
Yeah. My father, it's again, I'm the apostate Hindu, the ultra scientist, and what's the data? And but for him and my mother, it was that you bring your ashes to the Ganges in order to allow yourself to be released from the cycle of birth and rebirth and enter the state of nirvana, where it's kind of like a heaven is the way I think about it. But there was for me a sense of the spiritual connected to going there on the Ganges in one of those little boats and undergoing a ritual that has been going on for hundreds of years, more than a millennia at least, probably a couple thousand years. And people coming and bringing the ashes of family members and chanting these same chants and being connected to this whole chain of generations where there are things that, my father completed that came from the generations before him. There are things that he was passing on to me and my sister that we are responsible for carrying on, and that there is something much larger than us that that matters. That I end up calling it loyalty in the book. I wrote about oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name. Royce, a philosopher who was at Harvard in the late 19th century and into the and wrote a book at the very beginning of the 20th century called The Philosophy of Loyalty. And what it meant was that we all have he was arguing we all have a deep need to live for something larger than ourselves. And he went through a series of kind of thought experiments to demonstrate it. And one of them that really stuck with me was, asking if after you die, you were told that the world were to be blown up, that if I told you half an hour after you die, the world would blow up with everybody you know in it, would that matter to you? And for vast majority of people, it would matter. Yeah. And the reason why it matters to people is that it feels like it takes away that the meaning of your life would be gone. That our lives, that there's something more than our survival. That's more evidence that that we're not all, at core, totally self-interested creatures, that we are, that we have things we live for that are larger. Now, that's not the only piece of evidence. There's lots of others that he goes through and then others you can think about along the way. But that, for me, is that part of that idea. It's the closest thing I come to being able to recognize that idea of spirituality and connection and meaning that rises above your own life.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about, that that there's this intuitive, whether it has any kind of religious or spiritual formulation, this sense that how we are and that we live like has some resonance beyond us, beyond our lifetime. I mean, here's some very beautiful language in your book. You wrote, I don't know if this is in the book. Anyway, you said this or wrote this somewhere, that we are a link in a chain and making a contribution that goes well beyond our own life, and what makes being, and that's part of what makes dying tolerable. That's what makes being a mortal creature tolerable.
Yes. A weird thought came to mind. So I finished recently this 3-book series by a Chinese science fiction writer named Lu Cixin, Cixin. It begins with a book called The 3-Body Problem.
I tried to read those books and I couldn't get into them. Did you love
really?
them?
You know what I'm talking about. Oh my God, I totally fell into them. I
love the title, The 3-Body Problem. I was really drawn to that.
Right. The characters are unbelievably thick, cardboard. Like, they have no depth whatsoever. But part of what was, it has this extraordinary scale of time, partly because, yes, the 3-body problem is this other planetary system which has 3 suns, and the sun and the planet is captured by the gravity of each of those suns, and so every day you're never sure when the sun is going to come up, what the temperature is going to be, whether it's going to be 300 degrees or minus 300 degrees, and how long the day will last, all those things, and will it be a habitable climate or not, and the creatures will dehydrate, when it becomes terrible, and then when water appears again, they rehydrate and then continue civilization. But the span of this book, because it's all about the idea that a message passes from this 3-body planetary system to Earth and what the consequences of that are. But even our earthling lives in that book, they unfold over thousands of years, and he describes what happens over those thousands of years, and it pushes the questions, because what he's imagining is the extinction of human beings, but the continuance of other forms of life, and how wide our imaginations go towards bringing those in and making them feel that they are part of our chain of being. Can you have a chain of being that feels connected to people, not even people, these sentient creatures that can communicate with you, who are in the 4th dimension or look nothing like us?
Yeah.
And can we have a chain of being that goes on 15 billion years, that go beyond, Earth is extinguished and humanity is extinguished, but we still feel there's spirit in some way. I don't know. It made me think of that, and I kind of believe in that. I found it really beautiful that it managed to expand my mind to make me feel that I'm part of life, and that even after human beings are gone, that there is meaning in our little contributions.
I recently had a conversation with Junot Diaz. Also, he loves science fiction. I mean, and about how science fiction can be so valuable. I mean, I don't know. I think people who don't read it don't take it seriously, but there's a lot going on. That's a great example.
There can be a lot going on. A lot of times it's not, and it's just really fun. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not Junot Diaz's level sci-fi aficionado, but he's at a serious level. I'm but a tourist.
Well, sometimes you are called, I don't know if you refer to yourself this way, a public health journalist, in addition to being a physician, obviously. I'm starting to think of you, I like this language of, citizen scientist. I feel like citizen physician would be a good thing to call you. Do you like that?
I'm kind of hungering for when I earn the place of Oliver Sacks. You don't have to call him Dr. Oliver Sacks. Mm-hmm. Like you would never call Oliver Sacks Dr. Oliver Sacks now, right?
Yeah.
And that he's a writer and a physician, but he's not a writer-physician or a physician-writer. He's a writer and a physician.
Yeah.
And so they are connected. It's my source of ideas and exposure and a lens into the world. And I have this other part of me that's kind of a public health experimenter and do experiments with whole countries around what we can do to change outcomes in care. But I haven't figured out the word for it, what that thing is.
Yeah, to me, public health journalist doesn't do it. Just feels kind of clinical. Sorry to use a medical term. I mean, I feel one thing I'm thinking about a lot is how we've so collapsed our imagination about the language of public life in recent generation, and we've collapsed it into political life, and political life is so dysfunctional. So that's despairing, right? If we now just completely identify public life with political life. But of course, public life is so much bigger than political life. And to me, you are opening up medicine and healthcare, and these webs of relationship that we have with caregivers and doctors and nurses and even our families in the context of our health as also public life. And it is, I don't know, yes.
Well, the word that I really like to use was citizen. And what I'm partly trying to do is open the portal both ways. That the world of what happens to you in the course of our average currently 80-plus year existence is one where the people that are part of that relationship on the clinical side are also people themselves who are journeying through that pathway, right?
Yes.
And the lens that I want to put on this is that I'm here in, how am I the citizen? How am I just a human being, a citizen who is following my duty as a citizen and not just as a clinician to people? And I'm fumbling for this a little bit, but the sense that the portal that I hope I open is that I'm speaking not only as a physician to the outside world, but I'm also opening the outside world to us as physicians and nurses and others to think of ourselves as just citizens and to break down that inside-outside and to make it all kind of seamless. And I don't know, it's a sense-ability more than anything I'm trying to make happen. That
it's a porousness, though, too, and it's a conversation that you're kind of curating, making possible.
Yeah, and the sense of, I like getting down into the microscopic of the real stories of what happens when human beings care for one another and enter into these kinds of relationships. And you see everything that flows through there, money and jealousy and politics and misunderstanding and conversation and setting, et cetera. And then you can lift out of it and say, okay, but what are really our goals? And then furthermore, we're this interplay of knowledge and technology and trying to function in a world where none of us have a full handle on it all, and we're inside a system, and we have to have some agency in that system. And how do we not be powerless, and how do we shape that thing we're part of? And so I'm interested in not only the sense of inside and outside. I'm also interested in the sense of the microscopic to the telescopic, and starting to arrive at a way that that we feel connected, and we know the meaning and the feelings as well as the data about what's happening.
Yes, and I mean, as you write about, this is a sphere of some of the most cathartic, existential, and potentially meaningful moments of being human, of our whole lives, take place in the context of healthcare.
That's why I feel like I have the unfair advantage of my fellow writers at the New Yorker. Like, I live inside this material that is extraordinary every day.
Yeah.
And I get to think about all these really confusing, interesting, sometimes distressing things like, do we have a right to this stuff called healthcare? What, why are the costs so high? Or why do we itch?
Yeah.
And what the heck is going on there? And
how does investigating itching lead us to the question of consciousness itself?
Right.
That's what you do.
Right.
Yeah.
And and that's what I love. I love the sense that walking in the door every day and in the work I engage with, whether it's public health work or my surgery work, I'm exposed to all of these stories that engage these really meaningful parts of our life. And I don't have to have the struggle that Adam Gopnik, one of my favorite writers at the New Yorker, who, has to wake up to every day, which is, what am I going to write about now?
You have a wealth of material ready-made.
I've got all this stuff, right? Mine's like, what do I pick? Like my list is too long. What's the next thing?
I want to say too, I had this realization, which seems so obvious now, but I'd never thought about it this way before getting ready to interview you, thinking about this question of mortality and how we struggle with it. And, often when there's a conversation about the medical profession and how it has often seemed very callous, right? And especially if we look back at the way people used to talk to people about the fact that you're dying or, how that was treated. It's about the callousness and kind of hubris of that, but not considering that for the same reasons that any person who's a patient being told that they're dying, that most of us, for whatever reason, are surprised. Doctors are people too, right? So this desire to fix it and cure it was a manifestation of just the other side of the same coin.
Yeah, and I think also I'm really interested in the variation as well, that there is this cruelty that can go on and this kind of inhumanity. And I've seen it. I see it still, where people become treated as objects. They become treated as their disease. You don't see the person. You disconnect. Especially nowadays, you can remote control manage your patient from, your computer, rather than go in and see them and connect with them.
Like the medical corollary to drones.
Yeah, completely. And I have too many people to see, and really well-meaning people. Me, I can do this, right? This general sense that that there is nonetheless wide variation over time. There are moments where we become re-engaged, and then there's also people who have managed to avoid that entirely, and find ways in. And then the variation shows you who the positive deviants are, and those are the people I really want to learn about. Like seeing all of the variation, how people cope with all the technology and everything else we're bringing to bear, and then where we sit there surfing Facebook rather than going in to talk to my patient. What are other people doing that are getting themselves out of it? And then how do we scale that? How do we get that to become viral? How do we make that more of what we do? It allows us to start taking control of what feels like it's impossible. I don't have influence over this. Clinicians are callous or are not being humane enough. But there's always some who are doing better, and always
have been, always were.
Yeah, and I think the part of my attitude about it is that they aren't necessarily special people. There's nothing like magical about them. It's often that they simply have a different viewpoint, a way of looking at it, or a different system around them, or a different environment that they've created or someone else has created.
Right.
And if you can unlock that, you can bring that elsewhere. And that's the optimism that I feel and see that energizes me.
Yeah. I think my last question, the question of what it means to be human, and a big ancient question, it actually runs, it's not just being mortal, but being human that runs all the way through your work. Here's some beautiful language from the epilogue of Being Mortal. Being mortal is about the struggle to cope with the constraints of our biology, with the limits set by genes and cells and flesh and bone. The fact that we are limited is something that you come back to. I think you say to be human is to be limited. That has informed the way you have grappled with the definition and practice of medicine. I'm curious about how this fact, this reality that to be human is to be limited, which is also so hard for us to take in, how that spills over into other aspects of the way you move through the world. You move through the world as a human being.
The first way that I think about it is, number one, well, two things jump to mind. Number one, in my public health work, it's about the idea that we're all so incredibly limited, and yet there are ways that we string together and are extraordinary, almost unlimited as groups of people, and that when and it's the kind of magic of when that happens, when you all start pulling together and then you eradicate polio from the world, which we're almost on the verge of doing, right? That's just it's just freaking amazing. Like when you see that happen, and how these limited, flawed, and to me that was the amazement of surgery. Like we're these smart, great people, but we're all limited, and yet can pull off these incredible, risky, complicated operations and forms of care that give people back their lives and give them many years of better life. So that's one. That's the first one that I went to, and then the second direction was quite the opposite, which is that as I walk through the world, I'm constantly combating the fact that I feel, the sense of coping with that limitation and being constantly aware of those limitations. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons, which in many ways encapsulates me, is a gravestone that reads, "He kept his options open."
Yeah, right.
And my way of navigating through limitation is trying as much as possible to keep my options open. Like try to navigate with as minimal risk as possible, which means you don't accomplish anything. So I'm always fighting that sense of needing to take the leap despite the reality of imperfection, of mistakes, and push forward, make your bets. I have to make my bet without 100% of the information and certainty. And that's in many ways, to go full circle, the attraction to me about going into a field like surgery was very similar to the ones that drew me into the world of politics, which is that the best people I saw in surgery were like the best leaders and politicians I saw who recognized that we're limited, that you don't have all the knowledge, that your abilities are imperfect, the information is incomplete, and yet there are times when acting is the better choice than not to act. And then you live with the consequences and learn from them, take ownership and responsibility, and move on. And that sense of enacting that in our lives is feels really important for me to aspire to.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you, and it was a pleasure to really steep in your work.
Thank you. Thank you for driving the conversation. Deep,
I did. Thank
place.
you. You allowed me to take charge, so I appreciate that. We'll let you know when this is going to air. And again, I'm just so grateful that you made time, and love your work. Thank you.
No, and really appreciate what you're doing in moving the conversation around. And somehow somehow capturing a ton of people doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, well, I hope maybe our paths will cross in person one of these days.
Yes, I hope it does.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.